Chapter 10. Fear and Adoration. "Another suicide," said the nurse, sitting by the young man's bed reading the newspaper. "Society today, what's to become of us? I blame the government, closing all the pits, throwing thousands on the scrap heap." The nurse looked at her patient in the bed and saw that he was starting to wake up. She grabbed the young man's hand to check his pulse and carried on reading. "But this suicide's different. A woman called Ivy Goodwin, swept out to sea, they say, went in just as her daughter had." The young man stared and muttered some words, but the nurse couldn't make any sense out of them. "No!" he cried out, to the sound of cracking twigs and undergrowth, and the crunch of acorns as boots behind him hit the earth with each heavy step, pounding the ground. Closer and closer they came. "Don't!" he muttered. The nurse pulled down the sheets to the patient's bed. The man flinched. He was bruised all over. He stirred again and cried out, the pain in his side excruciating. Then he blacked out again. The nurse put her hand on his chest. She could feel that the young man's heart was racing, and his slightly sloping mouth was dripping saliva onto his chin. She dabbed it with a tissue. His hand began to twitch. The hospital bed shook. The man was having a seizure. The nurse reached for a hypodermic and searched for a vein. She injected him. The man shook and the nurse held him down. His eyes flickered. He saw the ivy shooting up the trees, racing for the canopy. The ivy with its red leaves and its green veins like reptile skin, skating around in the crevices in the trunk, bored in by the lava beetles. A boot in his side, a fist, another boot slammed into his stomach. "Stop it!" he cried out. The nurse swished the plastic curtains around the bed, then went back to attend to her patient. Everything seemed to be oozing. She grabbed another tissue. His nose was running, honey-like sap oozing like from the bark of a tree. The man clutched his knee. He could see the cut dripping blood onto the grass as the fists rained down. Then he saw the stoat frozen with fear under the shrub in front of him. "Ah!" the patient cried. "You're hurting me." He woke up. "You're having a bad dream, Mike," said the nurse, sitting on his bed with her hand on his chest. "You're all right now. You're safe." "Where am I?" he asked. "Safe," she said. "You don't have to worry." As the nurse cleaned Mike's wounds, he heard those dreadful words again, echoing in his head. "Kill him, kill the traitor." These were the last words Mike had heard as Catherine and Ivy kicked him unconscious, and as his eyes blurred over under the rhododendron shrub. Catherine had looked like a wild beast gone feral. A stoat that Mike remembered was the last image to fade from his sight during the ferocious beating. He would never forget that stoat. The nurse touched Mike's forehead, her finger finding a curl in his tangled hair. "How are you feeling, kid? You sure took a beating." Mike tried to smile, but the pain felt too severe as he made an effort to lift the corners of his swollen mouth. "Where am I?" "Wakefield General," she said, reaching out to take Mike's hand to check his pulse again. His hand was warm and damp. "Why am I here? Where's Catherine?" "Is she your girlfriend?" the nurse asked. She tilted her head and smiled. "Yes," said Mike, shuddering, feeling the cool air of the hospital ward on his exposed shoulders and arms. "Is she okay? I need to know that she's okay. You'll have to ask the policeman when he comes to speak to you. There's a policeman. He'll want to ask you about the boys that attacked you." Mike thought of Catherine and all those screams still echoing in his eardrum. "Kill him, kill the traitor." "Do you remember what happened to you?" she asked. "You must tell the police. You could have died. Who could have done such a terrible thing?" But it doesn't surprise me. There's not enough jobs, you see, not now all the factories are closing. It started with the pit closures, and now it's our manufacturing. 13 years we've had with the Tories, and now the kids are running wild." Mike went quiet for a while. The nurse shook her head. "Do you remember?" she asked again. "Is it starting to come back to you?" "I remember," he said, a lump coming to his throat. "Then you must tell the police everything." Mike thought about the day he and Catherine had left home together. The big day arrived in the form of a white van that was to take them and their belongings up to the art college. As Catherine climbed into the front seat, her father slammed the door after her. Mike flinched, before waving nervously back at his parents. Catherine grunted and told the driver to get going. As the van pulled away, Mike felt his heart starting to pound in his t-shirt. He knew that he would miss his mum and dad. Catherine, however, seemed all too eager to leave as she slumped back into her seat, kicking off her trainers. "You can put your foot down, you know," she snapped, as the van pulled out onto the dual carriageway. "That's telling me," the driver said, smiling at Mike. "I find that most men need to be told what to do," she said. "Keep your eyes on the road, and let's get there before midnight, shall we?" "Better do what she says," said Mike, now in charge of the map. Catherine looked at Mike and then back at the driver. He was a thin guy with a goatee. He smelt of cigarettes and looked emaciated. She then looked back at Mike. He was still too skinny for his age and needed some fattening up as well. "Where are all the men, eh?" she quipped. Catherine liked her men to be men, strong and tall, but for some reason she had ended up with a skinny short boy. The nurse coughed into her handkerchief. "How long have I been here?" "Oh, you've been semi-conscious for a few days." "But how long exactly?" Mike looked into the eyes of the nurse. She was now scrubbing his chest with a sponge. The nurse looked him in the eye and sighed. 6 days, she said. "So let's get you well again. We need to get you back to your girlfriend. She must be missing you terribly." "Hasn't she been told?" The nurse shrugged her shoulders and continued to wash him. Mike could see that the nurse had hands large enough to break bones. He looked at her with the sponge, conscious for the first time that he wasn't wearing any underwear. She dabbed his chest. It felt warm, but he squirmed in pain when the nurse slipped the wet sponge under his arms. He coughed and tried to blot out the stinging sensation by thinking of Catherine. Domestic violence had been a regular occurrence even before Mike and Catherine had moved to the house in Denby. She had started hitting him when they were at school, and it grew more frequent when they lived on campus together. Mike always blamed it on having to share such a small room and a single bed. He liked to find excuses for her. His physical abuse would have gone on unknown if Mike hadn't confessed his secret ordeal to the gang. He had been staying with his friend Jamie on campus, and the evening before Catherine and Ivor's attack had put him in the hospital, he showed Jamie and Brian his scars. His friends had warned him to stay clear of Catherine, but how could he? He loved her. "She really did want to kill me this time," he muttered. Horror flushed his cheeks, just as the nurse slipped the sponge between his legs. "Of course she wanted to kill me," he thought. "I was horrible to her. She was bound to lose control of herself for a minute or two. She had to. I was being useless again. She did warn me. I only have myself to blame. I always make her so angry. I must learn to control myself." "Shh now," the nurse said. "Sorry, was I speaking out loud? You need to rest." End of chapter 10, part 1.